I recognize the member for Nevis 1.
Madam President, good morning, and
Good morning.
good morning to members on this side of the House, good morning to the member opposite, good morning to members in the gallery, especially our children, and to those who are listening and viewing this Parliament sitting. Madam President, I rise very briefly to give a few updates on a number of the departments that I have oversight of. And I want to start, Madam President, with perhaps what could be a public service announcement from our Labor Department. We would recall, Madam President, that on the 13th of December, 2023, the Prime Minister of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis indicated that our minimum wage would move from $9 per hour, or $360 per week, to $10.75 per hour, or $430 per week, on the 1st of January 2024. We would recall, Madam President, that in that proclamation, he further indicated that as of the 1st of July 2025, we would see a further increase in the hourly wage, which would then move from $10.75 an hour to $12.50 per hour. Which means, Madam President, that as of the 1st of July 2025, our minimum wage will move from $4.30 per week to $500 per week. Madam President, this is significant. It is, in my mind, an effort to show the people of St. Kitts and Nevis that on both sides of the Narrows we have caring government. We have, Madam President, governments that are minded to ensure that our people are working for a wage that they can live by. Madam President, I want to use this opportunity, however, to say to our people that notwithstanding the proposed increase in our minimum wage, there have been some concern, Madam President, about the level of productivity. And I want to encourage our people to be mindful of the fact that while there will be an increase in the minimum wage, I am asking our people to simply produce, Madam President. I am begging them to do so. I am begging them, Madam President, that while this minimum wage will take effect on the 1st of August, on the 1st of July, that I want them to develop the habit, Madam President, of ensuring that they do the necessary work as required by their employer, Madam President. Madam President, I would use that as what I would call a public service announcement, Madam President. Madam President, I want to turn very quickly to the all-important business of water. And the general public would be aware, Madam President, that we have been engaged in a water drilling exercise here on the island of Nevis. We have completed 2 wells in the Maddens area. Madam President, we have completed the connection of one of those wells to our water distribution system. And we are waiting for the completion of the electricity to that site so that we can have a permanent power supply to that site. If needs be, Madam President, we can use the necessary generators to put that water into our system. But as of now, we are waiting for the permanent connection of electricity to that site to make sure that that connection will be in our system permanently. Madam President, we have moved to the Descent area in Gingerland. And we have made some significant progress at that site in Descent. And it's a mixture of good news, bad news, and good news. We have attained a depth, Madam President, of some 757 feet. At that depth, we were able to realize the availability of water at that depth, Madam President. Unfortunately, we had a cave-in at that depth, and the drill bit is presently stuck, Madam President. The drillers are presently in Trinidad, making the necessary arrangements, Madam President, to have that issue remedied. And we are hoping that they will return to the island of Nevis very shortly to ensure that that issue is solved and we can put the Descent well site online as well. From Descent, we will move to the Braziers site, and the Braziers site, Madam President, is already prepped. So once they are finished with Descent, we will move to the Braziers site. Madam President, I want to advise this Honorable House and the listeners that on March 22nd will be World Water Day under the theme Glacier Preservation. And one may ask, Madam President, well, what does glacier preservation have to do with us here in St. Kitts and Nevis, or for that matter, in the Caribbean? Well, Madam President, it is critical that the global glacier is protected, because if they continue to melt at the rate at which they are melting, a lot of our coastal cities and towns and villages, Madam President, will be and could be very much flooded, Madam President. So that is the theme for World Water Day 2025, Glacier Preservation. We are expecting that during the week leading up to World Water Day, that we will have a visit from our counterparts on St. Kitts, because they are keen and eager, Madam President, to see what we are doing as it relates to water on the island of Nevis. So they will make a visit, and we will certainly accommodate them, Madam President, during World Water Week. Madam President, I am also happy to report that, again, our Nevis Water Department, as did our Public Works Department, continue to give some assistance to our brothers and sisters on St. Kitts. Madam President, our sister island is presently engaged in the Bastia desalination plant here at Birdrock. And they have requested of us to have the services of our butt fusion machine and our team, Madam President, to assist in that project. And we are more than happy, Madam President, to give that assistance, because we believe that with continued partnership, we can both help to develop these two beautiful islands together. We are hoping that we will deploy that team between March, the ending of March, and May of this year, Madam President, to give them that assistance. Madam President, I want to move very quickly to the Public Works Department as it relates to training. And Madam President, between January 28th and February 7th, the Public Works Department would have sent off 2 of our workers to the United States, Madam President, to Lexington, Kentucky, for some training as it relates to asphalt, Madam President. we continue to see unprecedented demand for improved road infrastructure here on the island of Nevis. And we continue to ensure, Madam President, that we equip our staff with the necessary training for them to execute these works, Madam President. I want to say how delighted I am, Madam President, that we were able to see the successful completion of that training of Mr. Webb and Mr. Bartlett from our Public Works Department. They have returned and energized and motivated, Madam President, to continue to execute the works that they are continued to do here on the island of Nevis. Madam President, I want to move very quickly to our Nevis Disaster Management Unit. We have heard and seen here in the Federation, Madam President, the outbreak of hand, foot, and mouth disease here in the Federation, Madam President. And our Nevis Disaster Department, in collaboration with the Ministry of Health, would have distributed a number of emergency supplies, Madam President, to help in our schools to mitigate against this outbreak, Madam President. And I'm hoping that, I always say, Madam President, that I hope that while we make certain preparations for disaster and mitigation against disaster, I always hope that we would not have to use those mitigative measures, Madam President. Madam President, I want to advise as well the general public that on Thursday, March 20th, there will be a coordinated tsunami exercise here, Madam President. And while we make the necessary preparations for tsunami, we in this small Caribbean island recognize that we are surrounded by water. And I hope, Madam President, that the entire island, as a matter of fact, the entire Federation would participate in this very critical exercise. Caribbean Wave Exercise 2025, and I'm hoping, Madam President, that we will gather some very fruitful and important data from that exercise, Madam President. Madam President, I move very quickly to the matter of planning and environment. And I'm happy to report that on the 25th to the 30th of May, the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis will be hosting the Global Summit, the Global Sustainable Island Summit, Madam President, GSIS 3 2025. And we are hoping that here on the island of Nevis there will be a youth forum hosted by our planning department and our environment department as part of this summit, Madam President. It is a very important summit as it will give some attention to various environmental issues. And it will also, Madam President, highlight the progress and advancement that we have made in the move towards sustainable development as it pertains to our geothermal project. That will be a topic, Madam President, that I hope that the young people will be able to partake in and have a discussion on. Madam President, I want to advise as well that the United States Embassy has advised, Madam President, that the long-awaited Bureau of Standards project, we have seen some movement on that, Madam President, and we are hoping and eagerly waiting that we will see this $2 million project being executed during the course of 2025. It is a critical component in our development, Madam President, because I believe that everything that we provide for the public should be tested when it comes to food and water and those kind of products, Madam President. And we are hoping that we will have that project executed or commenced in 2025. Madam President, I am fully aware that we have spoken about a number of road projects for 2025. We have spoken about the Taylor's Pasture Road project. I am happy to report, Madam President, that we have seen the preliminary designs. We have done some preliminary design for the Taylor's Pasture project, and we are hoping that we will have the final design and see that work commence during the course of the first half of 2025. Madam President, we also have signaled to the good people of Rollins that we will see the execution of that project. I am happy also to report that the surveyor would have already taken all of the field data, and we are working assiduously to complete the design, Madam President, of that project. In Jessops, Madam President, we have been looking at a project in the Jessops area, just above the Jessops Community Center, that ring road. We have the costing, we have completed the design of the retaining wall that we must do around the community center area there in Jessops, and we are hoping that we will see the execution of that project very shortly. Madam President, the long-awaited Morgan Estate Bound Pasture Area Road, we have had some delays on that project due to some challenges as it relates to our financial projections for 2025. But Madam President, we are hoping that we will see the execution of this project or the commencement of this project very shortly, Madam President. All of the preliminary works and designs have been completed, and we are hoping to see the execution of that project very shortly. We are, Madam President, where we are hoping to see some work in that area. Madam President, in Newcastle, we have a situation in Newcastle where oftentimes we see some flooding in the area above the newly constructed police station. And we are in the process, Madam President, of getting some costing to reconstruct the culvert in that area, Madam President. And once that is done, we will be able to lift the road in that area where motorists can pass in that area in a much more safer way, Madam President. In the Ramsbury area, Madam President, we are looking at some drainage issues in the Ramsbury area, and we are hoping that we can also execute those works during the first half of this year. Madam President, there has been a lot of requests for roads on the island of Nevis. Just this morning, on my way here, I got a WhatsApp from a very pleasant lady in the farms area, and she was beseeching and begging and hoping that we can do something very quickly with the Long Point Road, Madam President. I want to say, Madam President, to our people that we have a very long list. A very long list. And I am sure that even if the Minister of Finance was to allocate all of the budgetary allocation for us in 1 year, we would not be able to get all of those roads completed in any 1 year. That, Madam President, of course, is not of much comfort to persons who are having difficulties with roads in their area. But they can be assured, Madam President, that we are doing our very best to ensure that we execute the various road enhancement and development projects here on the island of Nevis within our capacity, Madam President. Madam President, I did say that I will be very brief, and Madam President, I am getting some signals from my colleague that I have perhaps been a little long-winded that I ought to have been. But Madam President, I believe that those are the few updates that I wanted to bring to this Honorable House at this time. And I hope, Madam President, that with those, what I would consider to be brief words, May please the Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you very much.